So the basic story goes something like this, right? We have a mom who's letting her son and his wife stay with her for about a month while their house has water damage. And she works the night shift, so she gets home at around 6:30 in the morning, and before she goes to bed, she has this little routine where she makes coffee and a simple breakfast for her husband. But, like any good host would do, once her son and his wife move in, she decides to include them in that little routine. So she just asks them, hey, do you guys want anything in the morning, like food or coffee or anything? And pretty normally they say, hey, we're okay on the food, but we'd love some coffee. And so the next day, while she's serving them the coffee, she just asks again, like a good host, hey, do you guys like how it tastes, or do you want it done any different type of way? And I can almost guarantee you, when she extended this offer, she was probably expecting something simple like, oh, can you use this creamer, or can you make it a little bit stronger, or, just subtle pointers like that. But instead, the next night, she receives a text from her daughter-in-law saying, hey, I left some instructions on how I want the coffee made in the morning. And so the mom gets home the next morning, from her long shift, I imagine, and she sees these instructions, and based on her own descriptions, it's pretty much a whole-ass Starbucks order, right down to the details, like use these types of beans, I like this cold foam on it, I like it brewed or made in this type of way, and basically just overstepping the entire hospitality she's been extended, right? And so naturally, the next morning, the mom looks at the instructions and goes like, yeah, I'm not making all this. And what happens next is a bit shocking, because the mom does what I think is right and just makes it the normal way she's been used to, because again, this is just an act of kindness that she's extending to the guests in her house, right? And I'm not sure if the daughter-in-law felt offended that she had left all these instructions and they weren't followed, or what the case was, but the post goes on to detail about how they had a pretty extensive argument about the whole thing, and how the daughter-in-law said something along the lines of, if you're not going to make it how I want it, then why'd you even offer in the first place? Which again, I think is crazy, but this story just gets even more involved when the son steps in. Because, as a third party in this whole thing, naturally, I would imagine you look at this situation and think, okay, like, we are staying at someone else's house. Again, like I'd mentioned, we are the guests. So it's important for us to respect the boundaries and be grateful for the things that the guest is offering us. What happens instead is that he actually takes the side of his wife and goes on to complain to his mother about how she was being a bad host and how she should extend more hospitality while they are staying at her own house. And so that's kind of where the post ends. And although I was trying really hard not to give any of my opinion on it while I was talking about it, I think it's pretty obvious here. We don't need to have a extensive discussion or analyze all the little details. I think it's pretty obvious that the daughter-in-law is at fault here, and it's not being helped by the son. But the real reason why I wanted to make this video and bring up this story in the first place is because I think it's a situation you can very easily find yourself in, where you're either the mom, the daughter-in-law, or the son. And when you do find yourself in that situation, it's important to know which one you are and to know how to respond or act. So let's just start by looking at the mom, right? Like, I think in this story, it's pretty obvious that, especially when you're the host, it's important to be hospitable, for sure. And I think she's done more than that based on what we've seen here. But it's also important to set a clear and simple boundary so that people understand that, even though they are staying at your house, you're not bound to do everything or entertain everything that they want you to. And the next thing too is just to stop personalizing their reactions. Their disappointment is their problem and not your failure. So it's important to just understand that difference and to just depersonalize the whole thing when it does happen. And finally, the last thing I would suggest, especially when you find yourself in a position where you're being the host, is to continue to be hospitable, right? These situations happen where you're gonna have guests that come in and make these unexpected and unreasonable requests, but as long as it's within reason, I think generally you do want to continue to stay hospitable and recognize that there is a limit to sacrificing your sanity just for the sake of hospitality, right? And it's important to just find that balance. As for the daughter-in-law, the advice I would give is to just adjust your expectations, right? So guests don't give hosts detailed instructions. First of all, that's just not something that you should be doing. But more generally, just be tame about your place and your position, right? When you're a guest in someone else's house, you are stepping into their life because they're voluntarily allowing for that to happen. And so having that perspective, I think, is really important. And when you do communicate, just communicate like an adult, not through instructions or making unreasonable requests. Just let them know, like, hey, I like the coffee and I would appreciate it if you continue to make it, or if you don't like it, just simply decline. And I think for a lot of guests as well, sometimes it's difficult for them to decline or say no, but just understand that when you say no, that's not hostility, or you're not communicating any pretentiousness when you're doing all that. It's more so just communicating your preference, right? And in this situation especially, if these instructions or this request wasn't made, I think it would just serve as like an overall more pleasant experience for both sides. And the final piece in all this is the son's role. And many people might overlook this because he's not directly involved, as this was an argument between the daughter-in-law and the mom. But the reason why I bring this up, because there's going to be a lot of times where you need to act as the proper third party in all of this, because he was at the center ultimately when all of this was happening. So it's important to just recognize and be a neutral party rather than taking sides in this matter, because ultimately when he did take sides with his wife, that's kind of when I imagine things blew up as well. And especially when you're staying at their house for over a month, it's important to recognize all the dynamics that might be at play, and to just ensure that in general, if it is within your control, which in this situation I would say he has all the right in the world to speak up, it should be his responsibility to just mediate the whole situation instead of taking sides so blatantly. And so that kind of wraps up my thoughts on this whole thing. I'd love to hear what you guys think in the comments, but I thought this was just one of those stories where at the essence it's pretty simple, nothing too vicious or overly complicated, but just really telling about how we should be acting and behaving as guests and as hosts. So yeah, would love to hear your guys' thoughts. Let me know in the comments, and I'll catch you guys next time.